our next speaker, Joanna Ledgerwood, who is the Director of Enterprise Development at Aga Khan Foundation in Geneva, and is the co-editor and also contributing author to the new Microfinance Handbook. And she will introduce us to the new framework that the book suggests of putting clients at the center. Joanna.
Okay. Great. Thank you very much, Jennifer, and welcome everybody. And thank you as well, Bob. That was a wonderful opening to our day. And I don't know if many of you know Bob or have had a chance to read his bio, but we owe a tremendous amount to Bob's leadership in this field and the contributions that he's made over, I was going to say 25 years, Bob, but I think it seems it's even a little longer. But I also want to make a personal thank you to Bob, because Bob was kind enough to read the first draft of the new Microfinance Handbook and had the honesty and felt comfortable enough, I guess, to tell me that it really was just not good enough. And certainly toyed with the idea of just walking away at that point. I didn't really. But despite the massive effort I knew it would take to create a book that was going to be worthy of Bob's endorsement, he gave me exactly the right advice, and I'm just thrilled that you're here today for the launch, Bob, and to have started off the day. So thank you very much. Okay, I'm going to spend 30 minutes, and I hope I'm right on time, Jennifer, talking about the new Microfinance Handbook and a little bit about where we're at in microfinance today. Some of the things that Bob mentioned today, some that I'm going to mention, there's a common theme that will be repeated and is running through the day, and it's very much about the changes that are taking place in the microfinance industry. So I'll talk a little bit about that. And although today is officially the launch of the book, this is the only presentation during the day where we'll actually talk specifically about contents of the book and what it is. So we'll go into much, I'm going to give just a brief overview, and we'll go into much more detail throughout the day. So, oh, yes, I can see my slides. Okay. So 15 years ago, 14 and a half, there were 6 billion people in the world. The euro was just introduced in 1999, and the Google search engine was just being beta tested. That same year, I wrote a book called the Microfinance Handbook. And it was a book that was appropriate for its time. The focus was very much on building institutions, and as Bob mentioned, I think this was part of version 2.0. So focused on building institutions and ensuring that those institutions were financially sustainable. 15 years later, lots has changed. There's now 7 billion people in the world. Google is, I don't know if you're like me, but I can't imagine life without Google. The euro is very much in trouble, as we know. And it was time for a new Microfinance Handbook, because the microfinance industry has also changed significantly. And we're now taking a much more holistic view of microfinance. We're not so much focused just on institution building. And so that's, I think, represented in the subtitles of the two books. The original handbook, the subtitle was An Institutional and Financial Perspective. And the new Microfinance Handbook, the subtitle is A Financial Market Systems Perspective. And it's about that financial market system that I want to talk about this morning. So I'll provide an overview of the financial market system. And again, you'll be hearing this term a lot today. And talk a little bit about where things within the system are addressed in the handbook. And the objective is really that by the end of the day, you'll have a good understanding of this new approach to microfinance and have the ability to hold your own in a conversation if microfinance were to come up. So that's the hope for the day. So I want to start talking a little bit about where Bob left off, and very much version 3.0. What's happening today in microfinance? There's probably, most of you have read in the media or heard some criticisms of microfinance and whether or not it is really contributing to poverty alleviation and what kind of impact it has. And what this is, I mean, we used to believe that if poor people kept borrowing, which they were doing, then it must be doing good things. Because if they weren't coming back to keep buying services and taking the loans, then it wouldn't have been providing any value. But the more we learn and the more studies we're doing, we're really finding out that actually, as Bob said, it's not so much about microcredit, and it may not be that people are coming back to borrow because they're really valuing the service. It may be they're coming back to borrow because they have to pay off somebody else, and lots of media coverage on the crisis in India, for example, with over-indebtedness and things. So all of this is causing us to have a much more concerted effort to really understand what it is that poor people use financial services for. Who are they? What is their behavior? What do they need in terms of financial services? It's also, there's a much greater acknowledgement of the variety of financial service providers that poor people use. It's not just about MFIs anymore, and 15 years ago it really was. Just we always talked about microfinance institutions being the solution. The other thing that is really probably one of the greatest influence, and certainly has the greatest potential, is the use of technology to really improve financial inclusion. And so all of these influences have really led us all together to take a much more holistic view about what microfinance is. And as Bob mentioned, the ecosystem, financial ecosystem. Now, when I first heard this term, financial ecosystem, I was thinking of oceans, basically. I mean, ecosystem, I couldn't really figure out why people were using the term to do with financial markets. But really, like an ocean, lots of different fish and things going on, working together, lots of different currents, things shifting all the time. The financial market, the financial ecosystem is very similar. There's a lot of things that have to come together all at the same time. That certainly there's a lot of shifts going on, and we're seeing probably more shifts in the industry in the last few years than we have in versions 1.0 and 2.0. So financial ecosystem, I'm using it interchangeably with the financial market system. But financial ecosystem is a term that you'll hear more and more about. So I'm going to talk about the financial market system. And one of the differences about taking a systems approach as opposed to an institutional approach is understanding that there's all kinds of functions that need to take place in a market. So like any market system, it begins with the demand and supply, so the core of the market, demand being the consumers needing financial services, supply, of course, the financial service providers, and then the products and services in between that make the demand and supply meet. So it's these people, or these players and these transactions that make up the core of the market. But in order to make the market work better, there are supporting functions that are needed. So Bob mentioned Credit Bureau in Chile. That's a wonderful example of a supporting function that really helps to make the core work better. Rules is another fundamental aspect of the market system that have a great impact on whether or not the core is working better, and so the questions about regulation. So it's really appreciating that this is a much broader and much more things happening in the system than just focusing on supply, which is what we used to do. We just focused on the institution. So this is all the different functions in the market system. There's also a number of different actors. So market system, a lot of people assume when I use that term that it just means the private sector. It doesn't at all. There's a lot of different players that have different roles to play in the market system, and who plays those roles and how appropriate it is for them to play those roles and how long-term they play those roles is really dependent on the incentives they have to continue providing services. So clients are obviously a very key actor in the market system on the demand side, but clients. Private sector, normally it's the private sector who is most often on the supply side, also providing a lot of the supporting functions. Government has a very key role in the market system, very much setting rules and enforcing rules, but also providing infrastructure, for example, the credit bureaus. And then there's lots of other actors, different community groups, associations playing coordination roles. And certainly in financial services for the poor, the not-for-profit sector is a big actor in this system. So if we accept the fact that the market system is this new approach to increasing financial inclusion, where do we begin? And part one of the new microfinance handbook and the starting point for the framework for the market systems approach is really understanding demand. One of the most important works in the last few years to really help us try to understand demand is a book called Portfolios of the Poor. So this is the one book that we're allowed to talk about as well today. So just a show of hands, who's read Portfolios of the Poor? So lots of people. Does anybody remember what the triple whammy is? Or can tell me what the triple whammy is? Or one of the triple whammies? Pardon me?
Unstable income flows.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So poor people not only have low incomes, that's the first whammy, they have unpredictable and unreliable incomes, very erratic often. And then the third part of the triple whammy is that they don't have financial services to help manage these flows. So again, a lot of what Bob was saying about the benefits of financial services and having the ability to put savings away, for example. They don't have access to that. So Portfolios of the Poor talks about the triple whammy. But what's really interesting and most valuable, I think, about Portfolios of the Poor is the research methodology that they use called the financial diaries. And what it is the same people go visit the same households every 2 weeks over a year or over 18 months. And they record every financial transaction in and out of the household and all the financial services that are used. And by doing this, they get a very deep understanding of how poor people are managing their financial lives. And a lot of their findings are probably not overly surprising, but it's been fundamental in terms of influencing the microfinance industry's thinking about clients. And because it's such a fundamental piece of work, I want to take a few minutes and show a video of Rich Rosenberg, who's another great leader in this field and a close colleague of Bob's.
Does the book change the way we think about the...
Whoops. Sorry, not yet. Anyway, I want to show a video of him talking about the main findings of the book. So we can go ahead with the video.
About the impact of microfinance. I think there are a couple of ways that it makes a difference. One of them is that it points out the range of uses that poor people put loan proceeds to, well, both loans and savings. The classic story about microfinance has always been that people take out loans, invest them in their microenterprises, increase their incomes, and escape poverty that way. The real picture is much more complex. As the book points out, there's a tremendous amount of just plain consumption smoothing. That is to say, using the loan proceeds the same way you and I use loan proceeds, and that the actual business use of financial services is a minority of the usage, and in that it's consistent with a lot of other studies. And this should temper our expectations about how much microfinance is going to increase incomes. The other way that it affects the impact picture is the old story was that microcredit was making loans available to people who had no loans available otherwise. And as the financial diaries make clear, the typical poor household has a fairly wide range of financial products and services available, different forms of loans, including interest-free loans from family members to the village moneylender to supplier credit, and also various ways to save. And if you see that microcredit and micro savings, formal micro savings and microcredit, if you see that they take their place within a fairly broad array of financial services, then you're a little bit less likely to expect that by themselves they're going to totally change the lives of the users. What do I think the most important findings in the book are? Well, I would start with the central observation that the book makes, which is that being poor is not just about having too low an income, it's also about having an income usually that is irregular and unreliable. And it's because of that irregularity that poor people actually need and use financial services like loans and savings more than people who are better off. That's quite a striking finding. A lot of previous studies would go in and take a one-time snapshot of a poor household, and they might find that there were very small balances outstanding in their debt relationship or savings relationship. On the basis of that kind of a picture, you would assume that financial services played a fairly minor role in the household economy. But the financial diary methodology, where the researchers are in talking with the households every 2 weeks and are in a position not just to observe the one-time snapshot, but also the flows in and out of those savings and credit products, gives a completely different picture. When you compare the flows in and out of debt and savings instruments to annual income, it ranges from 75% of annual income up to even 500% of annual income in some cases. So the picture that it gives us is one of very active use of loans and savings. And again, the reason for this is that poor people living on less than $2 a day, very seldom are salaried people who can count on a regular income. And if the income is coming in sporadically, you have to find ways to continue to eat every day and satisfy other basic needs, and that means saving and borrowing. I'd say a second important set of findings is about the actual uses to which poor people are putting their savings proceeds and their loan proceeds. One set of uses can be characterized simply as consumption smoothing. The story that comes to mind on this count is a woman I was talking to years ago in India who had been in a microcredit program for several years. And I asked her whether she thought her family had more to eat over the course of a year than they had before she got in the program. And she was kind of a thoughtful lady. She considered it a little bit and then said, no, she didn't think so. And I asked her what good the microcredit was. And she looked at me as if I had a hole in my head and said, we eat every day now. So consumption smoothing is one very important use that the money goes to. A second class of uses has to do with dealing with shocks and emergencies. There are all sorts of crises that poor households are vulnerable to, and many of them require immediate amounts of cash to deal with them. And again, both savings and credit are a way to cope with that. And the third set of uses, people use savings and credit to amass lump sums of money that they need. My income may come in dribs and drabs, little amounts every day, and I need to convert that kind of income into the availability of a usefully large amount of money, for instance, to pay school fees, or to pay for my daughter's wedding, or to meet funeral expenses, or also to invest in a business asset. When you look at the uses of the proceeds from loans and also savings withdrawals, it turns out that only about 30% of them are used for business investment. The rest is used for a range of other purposes.
Okay, so Rich basically said most things of what I wanted to say about demand. But if those of you who haven't read Portfolios of the Poor, Stuart Rutherford and Darrell Collins, the primary authors of that book, have summarized Portfolios of the Poor in the new Microfinance Handbook. So if you wanted to read a summary of it, it's chapter 2 of the handbook. And I should mention that part 1 of the handbook is all about demand, which is what Rich was talking about there. So as Rich said, poor people, just like people not so poor, just like you and I, have a multitude of financial service needs and need a multitude of different products and services to meet those needs. So this is a picture of a woman farmer that we work with at AKF up in Hunza in northern Pakistan. And at the bottom of the screen, I don't know if, I apologize if you can't see very well, but at the bottom of the screen are I've just outlined some of the primary cash flows. The top cash flows are the inflows into the household, and the bottom are the outflows of the household. So this woman may be receiving cash for selling livestock, or she may be able to sell her labor, daily labor. She may be receiving a remittance from somebody either abroad or working in Islamabad. And probably like 80% of poor people, her greatest income or largest income is probably derived from agriculture, so when she sells her harvest. So these at the top, these are just examples of cash inflows. On the outflow side, there's both predictable expenses, like she knows she's going to have to buy ag inputs. If she has children, which she probably does, she'll be having to pay school fees. If she has a loan outstanding, repaying the loan. But there's also unpredictable expenses. Something might happen to her home where she has to repair it, or as in the video, a fire. A fire is very common. She may also become sick, or somebody in her family may become ill, and she'll have to pay for some medical expense. So these cash flows are very typical, and in fact, with a few exceptions, could probably be quite typical of a farmer right here in Canada. But the difference with the farmer in Canada is that he or she will have access to a bank account and access to insurance and to loans if they need to do so. So farmer in Canada, when they sell their harvest, they will have a bank account, savings account to put that in, so that they'll have money to buy inputs at the planting season. For a poor person, and for our farmer in Pakistan, she doesn't have access to financial services, and it makes it very difficult to manage these varied cash flows. So what we see is that really poor people their financial service needs aren't that different from ours, except they're much more difficult simply because they're poor and because their incomes are so low. And historically, the microfinance industry has really focused much more on just providing credit to invest in a microenterprise. So this woman, for example, wouldn't have access to microfinance because she doesn't have a microenterprise. She's a farmer, and often it was more the trading activities that were financed by microfinance. So we didn't really think about the day-to-day consumption needs of poor people, and now that we have a much better understanding of who the poor are and what their needs are, we realize that, in fact, poor people need services just like you and I, to smooth incomes, to build their assets, and very importantly, to manage risks. So in terms of trying to understand clients and their cash flows and how we can better provide products to meet those needs, looking at the livelihoods of clients is, in terms of how those cash flows come in, is really important. So if we look at the data, there's about 1.6 billion adults living on less than $2 a day. This is a study, I think, Bob, you did at the Gates Foundation. So 1.6 billion adults living on less than $2 a day. Only 180 million of those are estimated to be micro-entrepreneurs, which is where the microfinance industry has focused all their effort in all these years. So, for example, the smallholder farmer that we just saw in Pakistan was left out, and yet there's 610 million people like her that need access to services. So having a look at what the livelihoods are of of the working poor and how these cash flows come in and what their needs are is really important. In spite of the varied livelihoods that they have, they all need very similar financial services. We've talked a bit about consumption smoothing. Rich talked a lot about that in the video. They all need that. There's asset protection, a lot of risk management tools that they need. They need a safe place to save. Some of them need investment capital, but not all. Thinking Rich is in the video, he talks about maybe 30% of people using loans for investment. And one of the big financial services poor people need, as the rest of us do, is payment mechanism, something to transfer money. If you think about what we do, we have checkbooks, we have access to internet banking to pay our bills or telephone banking. The poor don't have access to any of that, and it's really difficult for them to be able to transfer money and to just have these payment mechanisms that are safe and reliable. So we're learning that, in fact, the poor don't have, they have very similar needs to what we have, but they have a much more difficult situation than we do. So what do poor people do if they don't have access to financial services? I'm not going to go through this whole list here, but basically all of it is really in the informal sector. Putting money under the mattress, borrowing from family and friends. I mean, I borrow from family and friends, so I guess it's not just poor people, but a lot of these strategies is what they have to do. It's all they have access to. They don't have the options that we all have. So, as I mentioned, part 1 of the handbook is about demand. The next step is really to look at supply, and that's part 2 of the handbook. And what I do in this, as I mentioned, there's a great acknowledgement now of the variety of financial service providers that are out there. And what I've done in the book and what I've done in this slide as well is I differentiate between institutional providers and community-based providers. As we know, a tremendous amount does go on in the informal sector. There's a real advantage to having services available right in the community. Bob talked about the cost to take the bus in to see a bank and getting back and the time and things. So I like to differentiate between the institutional providers and the community-based. Institutional providers are bricks and mortar, so banks, insurance companies, credit unions like we have here in Canada. And then the community-based providers are things like self-help groups in India. You may have heard of self-help groups or savings groups, money lenders, just a lot that goes in just right at the village level. And I suggest, not everybody agrees with me, so I guess this would be an opinion, not a fact, but I think that there's a limit for which institutional providers can reach down. I think that they're sustainably anyway. I think just given the remoteness, the small transaction amounts that are needed with very poor people, the inability the lack of infrastructure, all kinds of reasons, sparse populations, why institutional providers can't necessarily reach all the way down to the very poorest. And I think technology is going to push this red line down further, but I think there's always going to be something going on in the informal sector. And even here in Canada, I know there are informal savings clubs that take place, and so I think this is always going to carry on. And I think that one of the new focuses in microfinance is really looking at the informal sector and trying to learn from it and trying to learn what poor people are doing. And not just to learn from it, but also to improve it and to facilitate better services right at the community level. And that's something that the Aga Khan Foundation works. Tom mentioned the community-based savings groups. That's something that we put a lot of effort into with the support of both CEDA and the MasterCard Foundation. So there are, I don't know if there's brochures on it or publications on every table, but there's a description of our work in that area. But it's really a new focus for microfinance is to also try to learn what's going on there. So while I agree formal finance matters, I also think that we can learn a lot from the community-based providers. So it's also very interesting to look at, to measure financial inclusion and what's going on in countries. So there's this great organization called Finnmark Trust based in South Africa, and they do national surveys in most countries in sub-Saharan Africa called FinScope surveys. And what's interesting here, it's not, the countries aren't so important, well, they are very important, but not for the purposes of this slide. But what's really interesting is the yellow and the red. So the yellow, the blue, for those of you who can't read the slide, the blue is banked, so formal sector banked, the percentage of the population that is banked. The yellow is non-banked formal, so that's really the MFIs. And you can see that for most countries, MFIs are reaching less than 10% of the population. So despite a tremendous amount of effort and money that's gone into this field, we don't have a lot of outreach. And the other interesting part is the red, and what the red is financially excluded. So it ranges from about 20% in Lesotho all the way to 78% of people in Mozambique are completely financially excluded. So what this slide really shows us is, and as part of Bob's closing remarks, we really do have a tremendous amount of work still to do. We're not finished, but I think there's a lot of promise in getting that red, reducing that red over the next 30 years, that's for sure. So at the heart of the core, we've talked about demand, talked about supply, and bringing those two together are the financial services and products that the poor use. I'm not going to talk much about this. This is part 3 of the handbook, so there's a chapter on each of these products. But probably the most, two comments. The agricultural finance is a new chapter, and I think well needed. It's something that we really haven't been paying enough attention to, so really happy to have that chapter in there. And then also the promise of mobile banking and mobile technology. And I think that certainly holds the most promise of anything, and there's a lot of excitement about it. M-Pesa has, I don't know what the percentage of, does anyone know what the percentage of, I think it's 70 or 80% of Kenyans are using M-Pesa. I mean, it's quite a phenomenal success, but it hasn't been repeated in many countries. And I think there's something like 2 billion phones, 2 billion people own mobile phones in the developing countries. The technology exists, it's available, but it's just, what the challenge is now to really just bring that to scale. And that's going to require partnerships between banks or financial service providers and mobile network operators, and that's not always an easy mix. And we're going to talk a bit more about that this afternoon, and it's something that Steve does a tremendous amount of work on. And so Steve, we're just waiting for you to tell us that it's, you figured it all out this afternoon. What's that? Oh, right, sorry, right. Okay, so that is certainly where the greatest opportunity lies, and there's a wonderful chapter in the book written by a fellow named Ignacio Mas, who proposes that private banking through mobile phones for poor people is the future. And he talks about me-to-me payments, so instead of person-to-person transfers and government-to-person transfers, he says, no, me-to-me, it's all about my goals and reaching my goals. It's fantastic. Very interesting chapter 13. Okay, so we've talked a lot about the core, demand and supply. I just want to spend a few minutes talking about supporting functions and about rules. Supporting functions are things like infrastructure, so physical infrastructure, as simple as roads, being able to get out to reach people, but also cell coverage. I mean, this promise of technology is not going to make much difference if there isn't the cell coverage out in the rural areas. Another key support function is funding, and I'm going to I'll talk a bit later about the role of donors, and we'll also have a session about it later today. But as we've seen, funding is very much now coming from the private sector, at least quasi-private sector, impact investors and social investors. Another key supporting function is information. So, for example, the portfolios of the poor, the FinScope studies, a lot more information to try and to support different stakeholders to try to improve the services in the core. Coordination, a lot of work being done on financial, standard setting bodies and between different networks, setting up rules, smart principles, so that type of thing, advocacy work being done, Transparency International, etc. And capacity building, another key supporting function to make sure that there are the people, that there's the capacity in the institutions, both the institutions providing services, but also supporting the core and clients themselves in terms of financial capabilities, which we'll also talk about more. The rules are fundamentally important to increasing financial inclusion and supporting the core and making it work better. There's formal rules. The most obvious ones are policies and regulations. One of the things that's most interesting to me about the financial market systems approach is the emphasis that is placed on informal rules and just the absolute fundamental importance of understanding why the poor behave the way they do, and what are the informal rules that are, for example, gender issues, that homebound women. That is a very difficult situation for providing financial services if they can't leave the home. So a lot of our interventions need to really take into account these informal rules because that will determine their successfulness. So informal rules is really a key part of enabling the core. So all of these things we're going to talk about in more detail, but I just wanted to give a brief overview. So we've talked about the financial market system. So the core, obviously very important, demand, supply, the supporting functions, the rules, and the different actors. All of these functions within the core and these actors are permanent. They provide services on an ongoing basis and are there for the long term. But when markets aren't working well for the poor, as we saw in the FinScope slide with all that red, there's a need to intervene in the market and to facilitate it to work better for the poor. So facilitators sit outside of the market. They play a temporary role. They may enter the market temporarily, or they may simply act as a catalyst. But by understanding the market system very thoroughly and understanding what the constraints are to greater inclusion and what the opportunities are, facilitators they play the role to make that happen. So facilitators are often donors or they're organizations that are funded by donors. So this whole approach, financial market systems approach, is really changing the role of donors. And we're going to have a session about this afternoon, talking about the shift, and we're very fortunate we've got some senior representatives here to talk about that shift. But basically, 15 years ago, when the first microfinance handbook was written, donors' emphasis was really on strengthening supply, so giving grants directly to microfinance institutions. We're now shifting, as we've talked about great length, really understanding the demand side, and so focusing on building that core market. But as donors move, as the industry as a whole moves more to this financial market systems thinking and the ecosystem perspective, donors are really beginning to focus on developing the wider market system with an appreciation that that's really what's going to affect change and increase financial inclusion. So, with that, I want to thank you very much. And I want to just mention that we will be going into much more detail about each of these aspects of the system for the rest of the day. Also, over dessert and coffee, we will be having some experts come up and react to this financial market systems approach and also to the book itself. And there'll be an opportunity to ask questions in that session. But I think we have maybe 5 minutes for any questions just before lunch. So if any quick clarifications or burning issues people would like to mention. Yeah.
If nobody speaks, Ricardo Roserici again. I heard so far about financing, but the credit itself, it's also in kind of credit. The needs are fertilizers, the needs are cows, cattle, the needs are material for building or rebuilding a house. So, and I saw that most of the, in the figures, most of the population, it's in red, so financially excluded. So why do we want to bring, to create a financial structure? Now, in developed world, we are now in the hands of the financial system ourselves. Why do we want to create an additional network, financial network, while we can provide not financial, but in-kind credit? You give a cattle, and then you get back a pregnant cattle, and you get back a calf 18 months later. You give building material. The price, the cost for the retail, just for the individual to buy 5 kilos of fertilizer is not the same as a cooperative or a group to buy 5 tons of fertilizer. The prices are not the same. So how does it fit with your microfinance system? Is it possible, or it's an alternative, or it's a complement? Thank you.
I apologize if I didn't hear your question completely. It's very difficult to hear. But I don't think that, I mean, some of the, you're talking about providing in-kind gifts. And I mean, I don't think with financial services we're suggesting that that's all donors should be doing and that's all the development work that's required. But our focus, or at least the focus of the book, was very much just on increasing financial inclusion. And the way to do that, I suggest, is to really try to understand what's going on in the system and what it is that poor people need, and then facilitating that in a way that it will be sustainable forever, so that people will have, just like you and I have access to financial services on an ongoing basis. That's what we want. If we view financial services as providing in-kind credit, for example, or gifts, eventually that's not going to be, money's going to run out. We have to figure out ways that the incentives exist for people to continue, or organizations to continue to provide services on an ongoing basis.
Yeah. Sorry. My question was not gift, loan, which is different. If you provide a pregnant cow and you get back a calf 18 months later, it's a loan.
I think that's a great way to provide assistance. I think sometimes, not always, but sometimes in-kind credit, or even just credit to buy a directed credit to buy a specific livestock or something, doesn't always get repaid. I think that one of the most fundamental things about the financial market systems approach is to understand the incentives about why these things would continue. So, be happy to talk with you more about that offline. Nicole.
Hi, thank you, Joanna, for the presentation. My name is Nicole Pasricha from MEDA. I just wanted to ask about the section under financial services and delivery channels, and why you decided to include delivery channels under the services side and provider side, and what was the decision there of how to separate delivery channels from the service providers themselves?
Right. It was a tough question, and actually at the 11th hour it switched. But one of the most difficult and complicated things, and Joyce is here to witness, it was separating delivery channels from products. So M-Pesa, is that a delivery channel or is that a product? I suggest it's a product, but as soon as you get into mobile, attach a bank account to M-Pesa, it then becomes a delivery channel for that bank account. So I felt that delivery channels were so related to products that it was much more about that than the provider side. The provider side, differentiating the types of providers, community-based or institutional, whatever, was less related to the delivery mechanisms, because there's not unique delivery methods necessarily to each of those types of providers. But there are lots of things that tie in the products to the delivery channels. Mainly it's the technology chapter but it's not ideal. It's not a perfect split, as Joyce knows. Joyce wrote it. Okay, just very last, before we break for lunch, I just want to thank and acknowledge all of the authors that are here that did contribute to the book. I won't make you stand up, but you'll meet them all today. They're all coming up, so I won't say that. But I do want to give my heartfelt thanks to all of you for contributing to the book. Thanks.